GDI talent acquisition practice, we'll talk more about it as we go along because we're going to be drawing some experiences from this practice. But the practice really is a result of us getting frustrated many years ago at our clients' hiring practices. And we kept seeing our clients hiring, well, the wrong kinds of individuals. And it was either usually a failure in the way they defined the job or a failure in the way they actually did the talent acquisition, mostly the recruiting process. So we built the talent acquisition practice, which has been just a great success, and it really focuses in 4 areas. One is providing executive retained search. The second is through executive coaching and career coaching. Oftentimes, some of the people that we recruit, we coach them afterwards to help them increase their chances, improve their probability of success in the new companies. We also do leadership and organizational assessments, and we also license the methodologies, a lot of the methodologies that you're going to see in this presentation, to clients where appropriate. Now, to get started today, before we actually get full into it, I just want to be real clear about why this topic is so important. Without question, the most important responsibility of any executive is hiring the right people. There is nothing that is more important than hiring the right people. And so we talk about strategies, we talk about tactical elements of running a business, but at the end of the day, we do it through a conduit called human beings. And those human beings are the individuals that we hire, and therefore the way we find them, the way we interview them, the way we profile them, the way we talk about them, the way we understand them, and vice versa, them to our organization. These are critical activities that are absolutely important for companies to succeed. So our training mission today is to provide you with some frameworks, or a framework for hiring. And with all that said, I think, Chris, it's time that we just get started on this. So let's talk about superior talent acquisition. Chris, why don't you walk them through the framework of the 4-part series?
Okay. So as we were developing this new series, we spent a lot of time discussing on kind of how long and how much we wanted to present. And we really decided early on that we just couldn't present the framework in the detail that we wanted in just one session, in just one 1-hour e-learning program session. So we decided that this had to be a 4-part program starting today. So the first part, what we're calling the talent acquisition framework, we really want to get started, and by getting started, we want to share some of the research we've conducted over the last few years in terms of these critical discoveries into talent acquisition and how the industry is changing, and in some ways how the industry is not changing. We will go over both of those. Furthermore, we will introduce the fundamental 8-step talent acquisition process. We will share why companies continually hire the wrong people and what you can do about it right now. At the end of this program, we will spend some time giving you some actionable items that you can implement in your own hiring practices right now. And then finally, in this part 1, we want to introduce the Competencies, Qualities framework, which will really set us up for the next sessions. And part 2, how to create a winning job description and screen candidates. We want to help you find ways and learn what to look for in a new hire. Furthermore, how do you develop at least what we call a superior talent competency model that will attract the right talent, moving from just a basic job description to a very detailed and comprehensive competency model. And then at the end of part 2, we will share some tips on how to efficiently screen candidates into the talent acquisition process. In part 3, we will go into further detail with the competency and personal qualities framework and how to interview for those. We will share the importance of a structured and repeatable interview process, how to incorporate the new evidence-based recruiting paradigm into your process, which is really centered on the foundation of data, and then how to target the right competencies and personal qualities, and finally, how to use data to gain insights into other critical leadership indicators. And finally, probably my favorite part, it's really about placing the top candidate. It's how to use all of this data you've collected over the recruiting process and the interview process to make the selection process easier and hopefully to make better and a more effective hiring decisions. And then we will talk a little about how to engage and hire the best and top candidate, how to onboard these individuals, and finally, I think a topic that really goes, there's not a lot of information, some ideas for post-hiring activities and what you can do there as well.
Thank you, Chris. So in 2009 and 10, we did a research project. We later updated that in 2012 and 14. the primary research project was really to try to understand why managers and leaders in manufacturing and distribution companies have a habit of losing their jobs. You know, we had looked around and many individuals and many research organizations had done the studies of how to move an average performer to extraordinary performance, or how to really develop a great manager, or how to develop a great leader. We decided to do something different. We looked at the opposite. We wondered why our clients hire great people, put out the press release, brag about this new top quality individual that they've hired, and then 1 or 2 years later the person is nowhere to be found. In other words, what happened? What happened that we hired a person that was a misfit? In fact, we've used the phrase, stop hiring misfits, many times because that's exactly what a lot of our clients have done. In the study, we talked to over 600 CEOs and over 2,900 of their direct reports to try to get a sense of what the CEOs thought of the direct reports and what the direct reports thought of hiring processes. We also used this research, and we've applied it now in the executive search practice, starting all the way back in 2012. So let's talk a little bit about what's changing in the talent acquisition world. Well, first off, historically and traditionally, there's been a lot of focus on how to make the process more efficient. A lot of HR organizations, and oftentimes driven or pushed by managers that are requesting their help or assistance on the recruiting process, they focus on how to make it happen quickly. Today, the focus isn't on efficiency of the process. Indeed, if the focus is on efficiency of the process, it turns out the process breaks down. We need to focus on candidate outcomes. That's not to say that there's not ways to make the process more efficient. It's just saying that that has to be second to the quality of the candidate. We really have to look at what kind of candidates do we find and get hired, and we have to look at that at 1, 2, 3 years after they're hired to look at how much value they provided to the business.
So yeah, traditionally there's also been a very large focus on candidate sourcing. A lot of time and effort has really gone into sourcing candidates, posting jobs online, tapping into your channels, your referrals, your references, and building that network to find top talent. But now what we're really seeing is an obsessive focus on factual candidate evaluation. I think because with the advent of the internet, it's made the sourcing a little easier. Still a lot of time is required, but the focus now is really how to take all of these candidates, that candidate pool, and narrow it and really focus in on finding the right talent for your company and for the position that's being hired for. And so there's a really big move to focusing on factual candidate evaluation.
And that said, part of the problem with candidate evaluation in many companies is that the interviewing individuals or the interviewing companies don't do a lot of comparative analysis of candidates. Historically, there's been little comparative candidate data available. And a lot of that, we'll talk later, a little bit later about this, about the unstructured interviewing process that's prevalent in North America, if not the world. And so the end result is if you ask different candidates different questions, you end up with no comparative analytic data. So today the emphasis is moving towards the development of comparative candidate data. So data-driven recruiting is becoming really important, particularly in a world where people are smarter and in fact know how to recruit or how to get themselves hired almost better than we know how to recruit them.
Right, and traditionally there's been a heavy dependence on instincts or intuition in the interviewing and the recruiting process. From all the research that I've done, individuals that I've spoken with, I mean, I've had people tell me, you know, Chris, if you can't decide on a candidate within the first 30, 40 minutes, you're not a very good interviewer. And I'm not sure that I agree with that. Every time that I hear intuition has worked for someone, I also hear that on the other hand, it hasn't worked. Everyone I've spoken to has had some failures in terms of hiring in the past. So the new focus really, like we've been saying, has to be on the heavy use of data and the selection process. And we understand that, you know, intuition is never going to be 100% removed from the recruiting process. But what we believe here at GDI Talent Acquisition Practice is that we'd rather collect data that we can use to compare among candidates and use that as the foundation, and on top of that, still maybe rely a little on our instincts, intuition, but take all of that together to make a better hiring decision, not on just intuition alone.
Yeah, and that's such a good point about instincts, and we don't want to suggest that there's no value to instincts, because a lot of executives, we see it all the time. Some executives' instincts are better than others, but as Chris said, what we're trying to do is put instincts on top of a foundation of facts. Well, some of this is driven by the fact that historically almost nobody gets formal interview training. And this is really interesting to us, and that when we surveyed companies and talked to a lot of organizations, and particularly talked to managers, we found many managers had no formal training on how to interview people. And interestingly enough, we found in the HR function about the same low level of interview training. Well, today, we tend to move more towards robust interview training and training around how to develop people. So we have to have this training. Look, interviewing is a serious activity for serious people. You don't just show up and do an interview. You actually have to prepare for it, and part of that preparation is training.
And traditionally, hiring decisions rarely excluded and are accounted for interviewer biases. And this is something we will be going in detail in the next few minutes here. And as an interviewer myself, it's something that I have to constantly remind myself in terms of these interviewer biases that come up during the interview process. And we've identified 6 critical ones that we will be sharing. So the focus really now is on reducing, or if we can, eliminating those interviewer biases in the interview process. And a lot of that really comes around a self-awareness and an awareness that those exist in the first place.
And so that gets us to the end of what is changing. Historically, there's not been a lot of technology advancements in HR. Oh, sure, there's been the database systems to keep track of recruits, the HR or talent acquisition management systems. Those are large database sort of tools. They have some communication capabilities built into them, but those are not the biggest opportunities. So today we're seeing a lot of new technologies to help make the recruiting perhaps a little bit more efficient, but also more important, to make it better. So we're seeing a lot of different assessment instruments that are developed that are psychometrically tested and properly correlated. We're seeing methodologies for actually how to conduct interviews. We're seeing interview or reference mining techniques to mine references on an individual so you can get other references other than the ones the candidates provide to you. So there's a lot of new technologies, techniques, and methodologies, and we're going to start to share some of those. We're going to share the competency and qualities methodology with you a little bit later. But so there's a lot of new thinking that goes way beyond just database effectiveness. So to me, these are the major issues, the major things that are changing in the recruiting process. But Chris, why don't you talk a little bit about some of the critical discoveries that we've developed as a result of the studies?
Sure, and these are some really critical discoveries that we've seen, not just working with clients in terms of recruiting and hiring, but just in terms of our consulting at client sites as well. And first critical discovery is that hiring practices are generally executed poorly in most manufacturing and distribution companies. And that's a real shame, because Alan and I always talk about how do we attract young talent, top talent into manufacturing, and a big part of why there's a failure is that hiring practices are executed generally pretty poorly. Furthermore, candidates are generally distrustful of corporate hiring practices and view most recruiting activities as a low-dignity process. I could speak from my own personal experience here just a few years ago before I started working with Alan, applying to jobs and sending out resumes, trying to contact people. And what I can tell you is, I mean, if I even got an email back, I was excited, even if it was just an email saying, you know what, Chris, we're moving forward with other candidates. But if I ever tried following up, hey, can you give me some additional feedback, I almost never heard back from anyone. So we have to find ways to increase dignity in the process. And like we've been saying, there's too much emphasis is placed on instinct in the candidate selection process. So we really need to start moving more to factual, data, evidence-based recruiting, and that's what we will be sharing with you over the next couple of sessions. And additionally, much needs to change in the way top talent is hired, and particularly in the interviewing process. And that's essentially why Alan and I have put this program together, where we will be talking a little the whole recruiting process, but we really want to dig deeper into the actual interviewing processes and what you can do right away to dramatically increase your effectiveness in the selection process. And finally, what we've noticed is that better interviewing techniques in manufacturing and distribution companies can absolutely provide a sustainable competitive advantage. We always discuss the complex and fast-moving manufacturing and distribution industry, and when we talk to clients, there's almost no attention paid to treating hiring as a core business practice, and that's again a real shame, because if they do that, if they continue to bring in the right talent, and I would also argue continue to develop that talent when it's there, they can really, in times of difficulty or when the economy is down, that sustainable competitive advantage will definitely help them in the long run.
Yeah, so as you can see by these 5 critical discoveries, that there's just a lot broken in the interviewing process. I want to summarize and build on what Chris has said. That recruiting is serious business, and we need to spend appropriate amounts of time in the interviewing. We need to have structured interviews, and it has to be a dignified process, because a candidate's first impression of your company is in the recruiting process. It's typically they see some posting or they hear about an opportunity and they go to your webpage. Well, that may be actually the first impression. But the second impression then is surely how you treat them in the recruiting process. So one of the things we'd certainly like to see is recruiting become a very dignified process. It turns out that when we looked at subsequent research in the 2012 and 14, it turns out that a lot had not changed. The majority of manufacturing and distribution companies still make a substantial number of poor hiring decisions, and a lot of this is driven from the constant drumbeat of the need of efficiency. Back to this comment that Chris made earlier, which is we've had many people tell us that if you can't tell in 30 minutes of the candidate's a good candidate, you're a bad interviewer. Look, nobody can tell if a person is a great candidate in 30 minutes. That is just an absolute myth that needs to be scrubbed from our vocabulary. There is no way you can interview. We've seen companies who've interviewed people, and look, I've hired people my whole life in my consulting and training practice, and I know exactly how that works. I hired an individual 2 decades ago that was probably the brightest, smartest consultant I ever had, but he was a serious, legitimate schizophrenic, and he'd gone off of his medications right after we hired him. Now, in the interviewing process, had I taken enough time to really get to know him and not try to just interview a person in 30 minutes and then make a decision, I probably would have seen some of the red flags. Now, that's a pretty extreme example, but we have so many examples of individuals who are hired, and then they get hired, and it turns out their knowledge that we thought was deep is really superficial. Their leadership skills that we thought were developed are very immature. The communication skills that we thought were really expanded and wonderful, turns out they're amateur at best. And so it's virtually impossible to really evaluate a person in that theoretical 30-minute sort of interview. The second irrefutable fact that we would put forth is that executives lack a usable framework for interviewing and comparing qualified candidates. Now, this is not actually our discovery. This is what executives told us. They said this over and over and over again. I asked HR to find me, let's say, director of manufacturing engineering. They found me 5 candidates. They sent me the resumes. I interviewed 3. I knew what to ask them about manufacturing engineering, but I didn't really connect it back to the job description. I didn't really know what to ask. I tended to ask all candidates different questions, a few of the same questions, and then I tended to make a decision on how I felt versus having some sort of framework to compare. And that's what we heard over and over again. We also heard executives pondering quite a bit. Most executives we've met have pondered why we continue to not think of hiring as a core business process that has to be executed excellently. And so we heard a lot of times, and I apologize in advance, I don't want to be negative to the HR professionals who are listening, but we heard from a lot of executives that they didn't feel that the process was taken as seriously by their HR staff as it was by them. Now, by the way, we've heard exactly the opposite from the HR professional. So what it says to us is something is just broken in the process. We know and we can tell you that hiring is, in fact, a core business process and should be thought of that way. One of the greatest executives I ever got to personally work with was Larry Bossidy when he was hired to turn around Allied Signal. And he said to me, he said, I want my finance person in the office to my left and I want my HR person in the office to my right because I deal with money and people every single day. That's mostly what I have to deal with. And I always thought that he did not discount the value of recruiting, did not discount the value of HR, did not see hiring as anything other than a core business process. We also discovered, almost by accident in the research, that which makes an employee an excellent performer is surprisingly not what you think. We'll talk more about this later. But it turns out most companies think that education and experience are the keys to a great performer, to an extraordinary performer. It turns out they're not. But I'm going to leave you hanging a little bit on that one because we're going to talk in detail about that in the second session, session 2 of 4. And then lastly, we concluded that technical skills are incredibly important in almost all management and leadership positions. In fact, they're behind about 75% of the reasons why people lose their jobs. However, while critically important, they're not enough to foster extraordinary performance in any individual. So it turns out that technical skills are important. So if you're hiring an electrical engineering manager, you need to have somebody who really knows electrical engineering inside and out. If you're hiring a VP of supply chain, they need to understand complete end-to-end supply chain issues. If you're hiring a VP of operations or manufacturing, they need to understand the conversion process and all that goes along with it, technical, organizational, and behavioral elements of it. They need to understand that, but that's not enough to be extraordinarily successful. They also have to have great organization, great behavioral skills, and we're going to talk quite a bit about those a little bit later. So the question we always are asked is, why, Alan, are you so passionate? Why are you and Chris so interested in helping companies do a better job of hiring? It's just real simple. It's because it's really all about people, both bad people and good people. Adam Smith, the first economist in his book Wealth of Nations, he even said it back in the 1700s. He said, at the end of the day, all value is derived from the contributions of people. Now, he was thinking about people working in the factory, but today we would think about the software developer, we would think about the purchasing manager, we would think about the cycle count expert, we would think about the VP of Ops, we would think about all of these in the same way. It's all about people. I also have noticed in my career that a single individual can make an amazing difference in a company. By the way, amazing means good, but it can also mean amazingly bad. We've seen single individuals destroy operations. We've seen single individuals seriously damage companies. We've also seen single individuals who just shockingly turn everything around and make it look easy. We've seen single individuals who are just spectacular in their management and their leadership skills and their mentoring and their development skills. So recruiting is important because all success of your company is derived from people. So Chris, why don't you talk about what's remained unchanged in the talent acquisition business?
Sure. So let me briefly walk everyone through the fundamental 8-step talent acquisition process. Starting with number 1, defining the job requirements. We have to sit down with our hiring managers, with the team, and really develop a job description. And what we're going to do is we're going to really share how to turn that into a competency model, but in terms of what the needs for the position are, what are the requirements, knowledge necessary, etc. From there, we got to post that online, go to Monster, LinkedIn, social media, however you recruit, and then also start reaching out through your network and referrals and start sourcing candidates, start building that pool of candidates. From there, depending on the size of the company, the Googles and Apples of the world probably track thousands and thousands of candidates and applicants for every position. And from what I've seen, we can range from anywhere from a few hundred to 1,000 as well. And we need to find efficient ways to screen candidates into the process and narrow that candidate pool. From there, we have to evaluate candidates and really focus on the data and on the facts in terms of the interview. And we will share with you how to do that with the Competencies and Qualities framework. As we start to collect data on these candidates, and we want to really use that data to compare top candidates amongst each other in terms of the needs for the position as well, we have to start profiling. And by profile, I just mean putting some type of dossier together, an executive summary. We will share with you what we do, but we have to find ways to visualize and compare these candidates to make those better hiring decisions. To really, if we're going to collect the data, we may as well use it. And then from there, we select the best candidate, the best fit for the position and for the company. We engage that person, we hire them, and then from there, after that, we develop some really comprehensive processes to onboard this person, to get them up to speed, to get them assimilated into the new organizational culture. And finally, in our last session, we will go over how to evaluate performance after the first few months and the first few years that that person has been in that position. So like I said, this first session is really just an overall introduction of the talent acquisition framework. Part 2 is really going to highlight how to define those job requirements and how to screen candidates. We won't be spending a lot of time on sourcing candidates, primarily because there's just tons of great resources already out there. However, if you want to talk to me personally, I'll be happy to get on the phone with you and provide some of the resources that I've used in terms of sourcing candidates as well. With Part 3, we will really dive deeper into competency and personal qualities interviewing, that's steps 4 and 5. And then finally, with Part 4, kind of closing the deal, those final 3 steps: selecting, engaging, onboarding the candidate, and finally, how to evaluate performance over the first few years of employment.
So one of the things we want to talk about is that interviewing. And we're going to talk a lot about the interviewing process. And 2 significant reasons why companies continue to hire the wrong people are oftentimes involve the interviewing process. The first one is that interviews are just conducted poorly. We'll talk quite a bit more about this, but kind of inappropriate interviewing techniques and professionals who are doing the interviews not using some sort of comparative, methodical sort of approach. The second is this kind of inability to differentiate between the candidate's competencies and their personal qualities. Now, to the right, you see a picture of Babe Ruth. For those of you who are baseball fans, or almost any professional sport league fan, can you imagine a league without statistics? How would you know who a good player is versus an average player versus a mediocre player? And so we really have to have statistics that tell us, and information and data that tells us whether this person is a good hitter or not, or a good base runner or not, or a good fielder or not. And so it turns out that in baseball, there's a whole technology around statistics in baseball that have literally revolutionized the game. But if we take this to even a more pragmatic level, it turns out that there's about 5 additional reasons as to why companies continue to hire so poorly. One is a failure to spend the necessary time to properly prepare for interviews. So we will spend hours preparing for an interview of a candidate because we take this seriously. When we do talent acquisition on behalf of our clients, what scares us to death is putting a poor performer into one of our clients. And so we spend the appropriate amount of time doing the preparation for the interview, deciding what the questions are. So if we're interviewing for a chief financial officer, we're going to ask questions that chief financial officers have to address. If we're interviewing for a CEO, it's different. If we're interviewing for a cost accounting manager, it's different. So preparation is really important. Another reason why companies do such a poor job oftentimes is they delegate recruiting and interviewing to poorly trained or untrained and inexperienced personnel. The 5th reason is this kind of mentality that we call checkbox recruiting. You have a form, it's so prescriptive that you just check off different steps that you've achieved with that, just to get through the process quickly. Number 6, believe it or not, the vast majority of organizations still fail to clinically, that means objectively check references and to fully profile the candidates. By profile, I mean understand their credential integrity, understand their background integrity, understand, in other words, criminal background integrity as well as all other kind of background checks. Do referencing of not just of the individuals that the candidate provides, but deep referencing outside of those references. And the last reason that companies fail is people just get fed up and they just want somebody hired. Just hire somebody, anybody now. How hard can it be to hire a new CFO or a new VP of operations or a new supply chain manager or a new global procurement director? How hard can that be? There's thousands of those people. Well, we know and we can tell you that on our technical interviews, between 50 and 75% of the individuals for most of the jobs I just mentioned never make it through their technical interview. We've had vice presidents of operations that have had some decent careers but couldn't define the elements of cost of goods sold. We've had vice president candidates for a vice president of quality management position in a large organization who couldn't define what control limits are and how they differ from specification limits. We've had quality assurance people who couldn't describe the logic of standard deviation. We've had literally supply chain executives who didn't understand much about Asian suppliers or about other areas of the world. Didn't understand about low-cost supply source. And so companies just get in a hurry, and they don't want to drill down because it takes too much time. And when you're in the middle of deal fever, you just don't want to spend the time. So those are the reasons why companies fail. Chris is going to talk to you now a little bit about why interviewers themselves fail. Turns out there's 6 major reasons that came from our research.
Sure, thanks, Alan. The first one is loss aversion. And loss aversion is really the fear of losing the candidate. What I just really call this, we fall in love with the candidate. Their resume matches perfectly what we're looking for. They have the right title, the right experience. Kind of in that first screening interview, first discussion, they say all the right things, and we just want to move them through the process as soon as possible. Number 2 is incorrect commitment. And that is really an inappropriate view of the job and or the candidate. And one way we can really address this right away in terms of the inappropriate view of the job is we need to have a better understanding of what the job entails and the needs for the position. So that really starts with having a more comprehensive competency model. Number 3, value attribution. That is imbuing a candidate with qualities based on perceived value rather than facts. So we start to build the story in terms of the pieces that we're starting to read and hear from this candidate. While this person's been successful in the past in similar positions, so they must be able to be successful in this position as well. And we don't do our due diligence and really pay attention to those facts that might suggest otherwise. Diagnostic bias. Diagnostic bias is a interviewer's blindness to evidence suggesting a candidate is a poor choice. Authenticity dilemma is an inability to distinguish a candidate's real self from the invented persona. And like Alan said, this is an area, that's one of them that's very, very difficult. That really comes with experience, experienced interviewers, trained interviewers, and to really distinguish the real self from the invented self. And as a career coach myself, we all understand that when candidates go into an interview, there's some marketing aspect to that, so we really need to find ways to read through that. And a lot of that comes with asking the right questions. And finally, disposition confusion is the failure to identify the candidate's natural disposition or personality, and we can use some third-party assessments to help with that. So from there, what is the single most valuable technical advice we can provide you to improve hiring right now? And number 1 is to ditch the unstructured interview. Structured, fact-centric interviews are 6 times more effective in predicting job performance, 6 to 1.
Yeah, so, Alan Huffcutt at Bradley University, I thought said it best of anybody. He said, hiring managers seem to believe that a good conversation will allow their quote-unquote instincts to guide them to the right candidate. When we conduct job interviews, interestingly enough, we often base the image of the ideal candidate on ourselves. And so it's easy to get confused, and that's why structured interviews are so important. And it's through these structured interviews that we start to discover what is really important about the candidate. Is it really their experience, or their inborn abilities, or their intelligence, or their memory? Is it, what really is it that really will likely turn this person into an extraordinary performer? The research has been clear that what does not uniquely create high performers are these 4 items listed on the screen. The next session, in part 2 of this series, we're going to talk very specifically about what does separate average performers from extraordinary performers, and we're sure that you are going to be absolutely surprised.
Right, so we want to really introduce this competencies and qualities framework. We have to do a better job, especially in the interviewing process, to understand the candidate's competencies. Those are the foundational technical skills required to perform the job. And then we also, on top of that, need to really understand the candidate's personal qualities, leadership characteristics, behavioral qualities.
As Graham O'Connell said from the UK School of National Government, his view, or one view, is that the right competencies get you from hopeless to adequate, but the right personal qualities then get you from adequate to excellent. And this is consistent with our research, which shows that technical skills or competencies do in fact get us to kind of the acceptable, the minimal eligibilities to be successful. But those personal qualities, those are what takes a person and skyrockets them to excellence. Chris, why don't we talk a little bit about the 18 comparative characteristics that we look for?
Sure. So in terms of competency, there's 5 competencies we really dig deeper in our evaluation process, starting with job competencies, those technical skills. From there, clients are always asking us about really strong critical thinking skills. And in part 3, we will really go into much greater detail on how to evaluate and interview for these. Number 3 are communication skills. Individuals need to be able to communicate with their colleagues. Decision-making skills and judgment, really, especially in leadership positions and upper-level management positions, are critical. From there, we have to really also evaluate those personal qualities that really take an average performer to a great performer, like Alan just said. And what we look at is personal initiative, curiosity, imagination, and creativity. And then on top of that, we also look at ambition, enthusiasm, team spirit, collegiality, integrity, courage, tenacity, discipline, and confidence. And through our research, we found that all of these are very important, but the most critical are those first 7, and we will really start to focus in on those.
So what Chris is telling you is that there has to be a framework. So this is our framework that we look at. So, but we actually get more data than just 18 scores per individual, because you can composite or add some of these together and you get different sort of views. So we get leadership views of people by compositing, say, curiosity, imagination, creativity, courage, and discipline and confidence, and that can tell us something unique, something additionally unique about that individual. I will tell you that, as Chris mentioned, that the first 7 of these skills or these capabilities, you'll see later in part 2 of this series, you'll see that those 7 probably are between about 96 and 99% of the success factors. It doesn't mean the others aren't important. It just means that those are absolutely critical. So, good hiring takes a lot of time, and it's expensive to do. Whether you engage a professional recruiting firm like GDI's talent acquisition practice or do it yourself, it takes time and it's expensive. Time is money. It is critical to execute this interviewing process, though, correctly and as efficiently as you can. You're never going to have enough time to put every candidate through an exploration of all the 18 characteristics. So we have to interview in sequence. So it turns out we interview heavily for job competency before we get into critical thinking, before we get into communication, because the order at which you see is the order that statistically candidates will start to drop out. So well, I'm going to take a little time here and suggest how you would do this, how you would actually go about interviewing, and how we do it in our very successful talent acquisition practice. First thing we do is we ask questions in a defined sequence. We're also not afraid to end an interview in a very dignified way, I might add, but we'll still end it before proceeding to the next section of questions. And then we score everything and we evaluate all of these. In other words, there's a process for evaluating every question. And as we're going through the interview, when they answer questions, you'll find that people or candidates will often refer to an experience. And when they refer to an experience, we're more than happy to stop for a second and say, tell me a little bit more about that experience. And who was the person that you worked with on that project? It was Joe Dunn. Okay, can I contact Joe Dunn then? And so we will mine for references as we go. And this is one of the big failings of interviewing where you try to push it, because when you push an interview too fast and you don't have a structured interview, you don't have a chance to mine for references. And then one of the things that we've discovered is one of the great ways of making interviewing efficient. We could not have done this a decade ago, but now much of the interviewing process can actually be executed in video conferences. We have built our own interviewing template, our own interviewing platform, video platform that we use, and we want to interview people just as if they were sitting next to us, but by doing it this way, we can avoid a huge amount of travel, a huge amount of expense, both for us and the candidate, and we can actually get through more candidates. Chris, why don't you talk about what we can do, what our listeners today can do starting tomorrow that might help them?
Sure, absolutely. So here are 5 more tips we can implement right now to dramatically improve hiring practice. And I know we've already said it, but it needs to be said at least once more. We need to drop the unstructured interview right now. We know it doesn't work. The research tells us that, so we need to drop the unstructured interview. Number 2, we need to be aware of why interviewers can misevaluate candidates, and it goes back to those interviewer biases. And those are not unique to the interview process. Those really deal with human nature. And I can tell you what I do is I have those printed out. I have them behind my monitor. Every time I'm doing an interview, I scan them over before I get started. Once an interview is done, before I make any decisions, I look at them once more, and I ask myself, am I committing any of these biases before I make any decisions on candidates? Number 3, be very specific on the requirements and needs for this position. And it goes back to developing that competency model, which we will be going into much greater detail in Section 2. Number 4, develop a scorecard. Alan started sharing a little about how we score every question in our interviewing process, and that's a system that works really, really well for us, and it may not be the right system for you, but as we're interviewing, we need to develop some type of scorekeeping, some type of scorecard that we can use to collect data and then use that data to draw comparatives among candidates. And then one final tip is, I'm just calling it high touch, high tech, and we've talked about overall the recruiting process is a very inefficient process, but we have to try to find some ways to bring some efficiency to it, and we use technology. We use applicant tracking systems. We use resume parsing systems, but at the end of the day, we're still working with people, and we need to preserve that dignity. So one thing I always do, if I look at a resume and I just don't have a good idea of what this person, his background is like, I have no problem just picking up the phone and giving that person a phone call. At the very least, I think that's something that I can do. And, you know, this title of this 4-part series is Superior Talent Acquisition and the New Recruiting Paradigm. So let's kind of wrap this whole session up and what we mean around that. And at the bottom here, you kind of see the major components of the recruiting process: defining job requirements, sourcing and screening candidates, evaluating, profiling, and then selecting, hiring, and engaging a candidate. And traditionally, what we've seen and kind of what we've alluded to over the past 60 minutes here is that a lot of time and effort is spent in sourcing and screening, and that's not going to change. That's necessary. It still takes a lot of time. But after that, in our research and the people that we've spoken to, there's just not enough time spent in factually evaluating and interviewing candidates. So what we're suggesting, there's 3 major areas that really we all need to do a better job in terms of our hiring practices. Number 1 is defining those job requirements, which we will go into greater detail in session 2. We need to do a better job spending time with candidates. And GI talent acquisition practice, sometimes we have no problem spending over 20 to 25 hours with a top candidate, because that's what we feel is necessary to really get to know this person, to really factually evaluate their technical skills, their competencies, and their behavioral and personal characteristics. So we need to spend more time there. And then finally, we've collected all of this data. Now what do we do with it? So let's put it together in an easy to read format to really help decision makers take a look at at all the data, draw comparatives, and make better hiring decisions.
Chris, you know what I really like about this particular slide is it really encompasses what has to change with the new paradigm, the new thinking. We have to spend more time really developing those competency models, those job descriptions. We really have to think about goals. We have to think about minimum eligibility to keep their job. We have to think about success factors. We have to think about personal characteristics, culture, duties, responsibilities, authorities. We have to think about a lot more than we thought in the past. It also suggests we have to spend more time in the actual interviewing process. As you indicated, we could spend 20 to 25 hours with a top candidate. Now, we don't spend that with every candidate, and we wouldn't want you to do that or you get nothing done. But we have to spend the time. There's not a minute of those interviews that is wasted. Every minute is precious. Every bit of information we gather is useful. And then there's profiling, really understanding the person as a whole person. And that really helps us to understand, will this person fit into the culture, or will this person be a catalyst for shifting the culture in the organization? And so to me, these are really important. Now, as we start to wrap this up, we might as well talk about a few final words, a few things that are important. The first thing that we found that's really important that I want to share with you that I think is so exciting is that there's that in boardrooms and in the C-suites across the globe, this new paradigm that we compete for talent is just as important as competing for customers is finally starting to resonate. We're starting to see executives at those levels who are really getting it, who really understand this new paradigm of talent acquisition.
And we've seen new sourcing and screening and interviewing methodologies that can help to identify the best candidates. And we're absolutely going to share those with you over the next few sessions.
And then we've also discovered that there's a lot of new opportunities for executing appropriate background reference and credential verification. Now, this is a bit of a controversial world because there's a lot of laws, especially in the last 5 years, a lot of laws have been enacted across North America and certainly in Europe about how one does background reference and credential verifications. However, because of the interview and because of big data applications in the world, it has been made a lot easier.
And then finally, there's new approaches to negotiating win-win agreements with new employees and how to improve the onboarding process. So I just want to leave you as a reminder in the next session, part 2, how to create a winning job description and how to screen candidates. Alan and I are going to go into really, really great detail and really dig deeper in how do you know what to look for in a new hire, how to develop that comprehensive superior talent competency model that will attract the right talent, like you said, those eligibilities, how to define the culture, the authority, the responsibilities. We will go through all of that. And then we will share some tips how to efficiently screen candidates into the interviewing process.
And with that tends to wrap up the program, but I'm sure that some people have some questions. So we always like to allow people to share any questions that they might have. And so we're going to give you about 30 seconds here. If you haven't already recorded your questions, we're going to give you about 30 seconds to record a question there. You can just type it in the question area, and we will be able to see it. So the first question comes from Diane. Diane talks about how many, so I'm actually reading this, and so it says, paraphrase, I'm looking for a new vice president of quality management and services. Let's just presume it's for quality. And I probably have 400 or 500 resumes in front of me. What's the best way to screen those resumes? Chris, you want to take a jump at that?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is an area where we have to probably use a system. And when we do recruiting ourselves, we've done similar positions in the past, and we've had 600 to 700 resumes. And as much as I love to sit down and read every resume, I know I just can't do that. So we need to rely on some type of applicant tracking system, really develop keywords to parse resumes. And one way we can really do a better job of that is really identify some really strong keywords based on skill sets required for the position. We spend a lot of time really digging deep into, they need to know Lean, Six Sigma. So those are the things we'll be looking for on the resume. And then you're going to narrow that down to hopefully a smaller pool, and at that point you have to just start taking a look at the resume. At some point you just can't, you have to take a look at the resume and read it.
All right, and interestingly enough, that's the only question we have today, probably because people are listening intently. So with that, I am going to wrap up today's program. I'm going to thank you for attending on behalf of GDI Consulting and Training Company, and specifically on behalf of our talent acquisition practice. I'd like to thank you for attending. My name is Alan Dunn, and I've been joined today by Christopher Rios. We've enjoyed this time. You can download this document, a PDF of this whole document, just by clicking on the download section, and everything will be fine. So we appreciate you all attending. Everybody have a good day. Bye-bye.